Commander Vex 9 called humans ridiculous and laughed at their 43% combat scores. He said special operations were impossible for our species. Then Captain Maya Torres stepped into the simulation chamber. I watched her calm demeanor as she asked about environmental hazards. The technicians didn't know what was coming. The holo display cast that familiar blue glow across the observation deck, projecting the latest batch of recruitment scores. Human results clustered so tightly at the bottom, they almost formed a single red smear across the graph. Commander Vex 9's finger stabbed toward the display, zeroing in on that 43% average mark. Genuine amusement colored his voice, the kind that comes from seeing a confirmed belief validated once again. His second, Krill, stood beside him, mandibles clicking in rhythmic agreement. They both operated within a comfortable, unshakable consensus. They fell into the familiar rhythm of assessment. Vex 9 detailed the standard list of deficiencies: no bio-augmented musculature, no neural processing boosters, no reactive dermal plating. They spoke of humans as one might discuss a historical curiosity, a species that had stumbled into the stars through sheer persistence rather than any inherent superiority. The term special operations came up, and Vex 9 actually laughed. It was a sharp, dismissive sound. He repeated it slowly as if tasting the absurdity of the phrase. Their laughter echoed off the polished surfaces of the observation deck. It was the sound of complete confidence, of a universe that made sense according to their metrics. I recorded every word, of course. It was procedure. My console automatically logged their exchange, the system itself tagging it as typical debrief banter species evaluation. The routine was so ingrained, so unquestioned, neither of them even glanced at the calibration logs for the testing protocols. It never occurred to them that a system designed by and for enhanced physiologies might not measure baseline capabilities accurately. They saw the numbers and accepted them as absolute truth. The tools were infallible, therefore the subject was deficient. That arrogance was a tangible thing in the room, a smug certainty that their understanding of strength and capability was complete. They were so busy confirming their biases, they missed the fundamental flaw in their own methodology. The assumption that what they could measure was all that mattered. That particular brand of confidence has a way of setting you up for a truly spectacular fall. I watched them, noting the timestamp on my log. The chamber prep indicators were active down in the bay. Their undoing was literally suiting up just 3 levels below us, and they had no idea. They were still chuckling about human frailty, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire framework of evaluation was about to be rendered completely irrelevant. The hour was ticking down, and the sound of their laughter was about to be replaced by something far more interesting, the sound of shattered assumptions. Maya Torres entered the prep area with the kind of quiet focus you'd expect from someone preparing for a morning walk, not a high-stress combat trial. Her biosigns appeared on my monitor, and I experienced my first moment of cognitive dissonance. Her stress markers registered so far below galactic standard norms that the medical AI flashed a hardware malfunction alert. It assumed the biometric sensors had to be faulty. They weren't, while the other recruits in their respective chambers were already showing elevated heart rates and adrenaline spikes. Their focus narrowed to basic survival instincts. Torres was asking the prep technician a question. Her voice was level, almost conversational. She wanted to know the specific types of environmental variables programmed into the simulation. Were there variable gravity zones, unstable tectonic plates, toxic atmospheric particulates? The technician just stared at her for a solid 3 seconds before checking his datapad, confused. No one had ever asked that before. The question itself was a data point, and it was unprecedented. I pulled her file. The background was sparse, mostly human military designations that didn't map cleanly onto our charts. It mentioned special operations, a term Vex 9 had just finished mocking. The examiners upstairs, seeing the same data, dismissed it outright. They classified it as primitive experience, the kind of small-scale tribal conflict that wouldn't translate to a modern, multi-species battlefield. It was written off as irrelevant. A footnote. Through the observation glass, I watched her. She went through a series of slow, deliberate stretches. Not the aggressive, muscle-priming flexes of a warrior, but the calm, efficient motions of a professional preparing for a task. There was no posturing, no visible aggression, none of the tells we were trained to look for in combat candidates. In the chamber next to hers, a hulking Cathar recruit was already slamming his fists against the wall, roaring at the technicians. His stress readouts were climbing into the red. Torres's remained a flat, impossible green. The contrast was jarring. This wasn't the absence of fear. It was the presence of a deep, unnerving control. It was a qualitative difference, not a quantitative one. That quiet confidence was the first clue. It was a signal our system was unequipped to interpret. We were calibrated to measure the volume of a scream, the intensity of a threat display. We had no metrics for silent readiness. Her calm was a language we didn't speak, and because we couldn't understand it, we rationalized it away as ignorance or malfunction. We were so busy looking for the storm, we missed the significance of the perfect, unnatural stillness that precedes it. The technicians finished their prep, their pity for her now mixed with a slight confusion. They were about to throw her into the galaxy's most advanced meat grinder, and she looked like she was waiting for a bus. The combat chamber sat at the operational heart of the facility, a massive hexagonal space lined with holographic emitters and force field projectors. It represented the collective wisdom, or perhaps paranoia, of 17 advanced star systems. Each had contributed its most punishing battle scenarios, a greatest hits compilation of tactical nightmares designed to break even the most hardened warriors. The result was a brutal, unforgiving gauntlet. Wave protocols initiated with standard infantry analogs but escalated with ruthless efficiency. Simulated hostiles appeared with energy shields that could deflect plasma fire, aerial drones that coordinated attacks in overlapping kill zones, and armored mechs that could withstand anti-vehicle ordnance. The challenges were not just physical, they were cognitive, designed to overwhelm an individual's processing capacity. The system itself was a marvel of analytical cruelty. It didn't just track whether you lived or died. It measured 317 distinct variables. It logged the microsecond shift in your pupils indicating target acquisition, the subtle weight distribution in your stance before movement, the neural delay between identifying a threat and initiating a response. It quantified every breath, every twitch, every decision. Its internal leaderboard was a testament to its severity. No organic being had ever breached the 92% threshold. It was considered a biological limitation. Watching from my station, I saw the real power of the system. The controlling AI was adaptive. If a recruit showed a particular strength, say exceptional long-range accuracy, the simulation would immediately begin spawning enemies that closed the distance or employed visual obscurement. It learned your patterns and then weaponized them against you. It countered success with escalating tailored opposition. The technicians at the control console prepped the run. They toggled the settings to maximum difficulty as a matter of standard procedure. There were no special adjustments made for the human. They entered her physiological parameters from the medical scan, her species classification, her supposed special operations background. Their movements were efficient, practiced. I noted the slight downward tilt of one tech's head, a subtle shake. It was a gesture of pity, the kind you offer to someone walking into a situation they cannot possibly understand. The console processed the input data. The predictive algorithm, fed with centuries of performance records, calculated the probable outcome. It projected a high likelihood of incapacitation within the first engagement sequence. It gave her a less than 2% chance of surviving the third wave. The numbers flashed on the screen, a cold numerical death sentence. The technicians accepted it without question. It was just data, reliable, predictable data. They initiated the sequence. The chamber's interior shimmered, the sterile white walls dissolving into a simulated urban battlefield under a bruised purple sky. The air in the observation deck grew still. Up in command, Vex 9 and Krill were still chatting, barely glancing at the main feed. They were waiting for the inevitable, quick conclusion. The system had judged her. The chamber was ready. And down below, Maya Torres stood calmly in the center of the storm that was about to be unleashed upon her. Her weapon held in a low, ready position, her expression utterly unchanged. The countdown hit 0. The simulation bloomed into existence around her, a dense chemical fog rolling across a shattered plaza. Standard first-wave protocol. 3 hostiles materialized from the gloom, their weapons cycling up with that familiar high-pitched whine. I saw the lead hostile's shoulder dip, the first micro-movement of its weapon raising toward a firing position. It never completed the action. Maya Torres's own weapon was already level. There was no dramatic sweep, no shouted challenge. Just a single, precise energy pulse that struck the hostile's cranial housing dead center. The target acquisition was so fast it seemed to precede the threat itself. The hostile collapsed into dissipating light before its own systems had even finished initializing. 2 more figures emerged from the mist on her flanks. Her response was a study in brutal economy. A slight pivot of her hips, a controlled trigger pull. A second hostile dropped. Another pivot, another shot, a third. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 seconds. 3 hostiles eliminated with 3 shots. Each hit was identical. A perfect centered mass shot to the primary processing unit. It was the kind of shooting you see from a targeting computer, not a living, breathing organism with reflexes and nerves. The most unnerving part was the lack of transition. One moment she was that calm woman from the prep room, standing relaxed. The next she was a perfectly efficient instrument of termination. There was no shift in her breathing on the biometrics, no adrenaline spike, no change in her facial expression, which remained one of focused concentration. It was as if a switch had been flipped, but the light it controlled had been on the whole time, just waiting for a reason to be seen. Down in the monitoring pit, a low murmur started. One of the technicians tapped his screen, frowned, and tapped it again. He called his superior over. Her reaction times weren't just good. They were falling outside the parameters the system was built to measure. The instruments were reporting values that the code interpreted as errors, glitches in the data stream. The system assumed something was wrong with the sensors because the numbers she was producing were, according to all known biology, impossible. She began to move. It wasn't the headlong sprint or cautious crawl we were used to seeing. She flowed between points of cover with an efficiency that seemed almost preternatural. She never took the most obvious path. She chose routes that offered overlapping concealment. Her movement timed to the milliseconds between simulated patrol sweeps. She wasn't just using cover. She was using the entire environment as a single, cohesive tool. And she never fired a wasted shot. Her weapon remained silent until the exact moment a target presented itself. There was no suppression fire, no hopeful shots into obscuring fog. Every trigger pull resulted in a termination. The system's initial report for the first engagement sequence flashed on the main console. Accuracy 100%, threat neutralization 100%, efficiency rating maximum. A perfect score. The 2 technicians monitoring her station looked at each other. One shook his head slowly. The other just stared at the data, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as if he didn't know what command to enter next. This clean surgical dismantling of a combat scenario wasn't in the data models for her species. Her file listed standard human physiological limitations: slower neural conductivity, inferior muscle fiber density, subpar visual acuity. The numbers on the screen were a direct contradiction to everything in that file. The system had been designed to break recruits. She was breaking the system's understanding of what was possible. The fog of the first sequence dissolved, and the second wave materialized with a distinct, heavier thrum of power. These weren't basic infantry. These were Varaxian stalwarts, their entire forms encased in thick ablative plating, personal energy shields flickering to life with a visible shimmering dome. Standard doctrine for engaging them involved sustained heavy weapons fire from a fixed covered position to overload the shield generators. That's what the manual said. That's what every recruit from a dozen species was trained to do. Maya Torres immediately broke the doctrine. She didn't seek heavy weapons. She didn't take cover. Her head tilted slightly, her eyes scanning the environment, not the threats themselves. Then she moved. She sidestepped a cutting beam from the first stalwart, and instead of returning fire at its shielded front, she fired a single, precise shot at a conduit on the wall behind it. The conduit exploded, spraying superheated coolant across the stalwart's rear flank. The shield, designed to deflect directed energy from the front, did nothing against an environmental splash effect from behind. The plating on its back warped and buckled. The hostile staggered, its systems momentarily disrupted. A single shot from her rifle finished it. She had used the room itself as a weapon. Her movement was the next anomaly. It wasn't in the textbooks. She would take 3 quick steps forward, pivot on her heel, and take 2 back. Her body constantly oriented at angles that defied clear lines of sight. She used low walls and debris not just for protection, but as platforms, vaulting over them to change elevation unexpectedly. It was a fluid, almost disorienting pattern. It looked inefficient. It was brutally effective. A technician's voice crackled over the comm, tight with confusion. He reported that her tactical adaptability index was pegging the scale. The metric was designed to measure how quickly a subject could learn and apply new countermeasures. Her reading wasn't just high, it was returning an overflow error. The system's algorithm couldn't compute the speed of her adjustments. More disturbingly, the system log showed her compensating for variables that weren't even in the official parameter list. Minor fluctuations in gravity from the simulated planetary core, particulate density in the air affecting beam cohesion, the refractive index of the shields themselves. She was factoring in data the simulation's own programmers had deemed irrelevant to combat performance. I watched her turn a clear disadvantage into a lethal opportunity. She let a stalwart corner her against a collapsed girder, a textbook death trap. As it advanced, she fired at the girder's compromised welds above her. The entire structure gave way, collapsing onto the hostile, crushing it under tons of simulated steel. She'd already rolled clear the moment she pulled the trigger. She wasn't just fighting the enemies. She was reprogramming the battlefield in real time. The simulation AI, sensing this anomaly, reacted. A soft chime echoed in the control room. It was overriding the standard wave timer, initiating the 3rd phase ahead of schedule. The difficulty ramped up significantly. More hostiles, better coordination, advanced weaponry. Pressure was being applied. The system's way of crushing outliers. Her response to this increased threat was not to become more aggressive or frantic. She became quieter. Her movements grew even more economical. Her shots even more precise. The wasted motion from the first wave evaporated entirely. It was as if the increased challenge simply focused her further, honing her into a finer, sharper instrument. Up in the observation deck, the casual chatter had ceased. Vex 9 was leaning forward, his earlier amusement gone, replaced by a sharp analytical focus. Krill was silent, his manipulator claws still. They were no longer watching a predictable test. They were watching a phenomenon. The understanding was dawning on them, slowly and uncomfortably, that their metrics, their doctrines, their entire understanding of warfare was being dismantled before their eyes by a single unaugmented human. This wasn't an exceptional performance. This was a category error. The environmental shift for Wave 4 was unmistakable. The ground vibrated with the heavy mechanical footfalls of the Karnak siege mechs. These were not mere opponents. They were mobile fortresses. Their armor was a composite alloy rated to withstand sustained fire from ship-mounted plasma cannons. Their energy shielding could deflect concentrated artillery barrages. Standard doctrine for engaging a Karnax was brutally simple. You didn't. You called for orbital support or initiated an immediate tactical retreat. Their deployment in a recruitment test was a formality, a showpiece to demonstrate the upper limits of the simulation's lethality. It was the system's way of saying the exercise was over. Maya Torres did not retreat. She did not call for support that wouldn't come. She did something that made the technicians in the control room freeze mid-action. She ran directly toward them. It was a move so counterintuitive, so fundamentally insane, that for a moment the system itself seemed to hesitate, its target tracking algorithm struggling to compute the intent behind the action. She was a lone, unarmored figure charging a line of walking tanks. Her movement was not a straight-line sprint. It was a series of sharp, seemingly erratic changes in direction, a quick dash forward, a sudden lateral juke to the left, a roll, another burst forward at a slightly different angle. To any observer trained in galactic combat doctrine, it was chaos. It looked like panic, a desperate animal running from a predator. It made no tactical sense. It violated every principle of energy conservation and target profile minimization. It was the kind of movement that should have gotten her vaporized in the first 2 seconds. Yet she wasn't hit. The mech's heavy cannons tracked her, fired, and missed. The energy blasts tore craters in the ground where she had been a fraction of a second before. She wasn't just dodging the shots randomly. She was anticipating the firing solutions. I watched the trajectory analysis overlay on my screen. Her zigzag pattern was a perfect real-time counter to the mech's predictive targeting. She was moving into the blind spots of their firing arcs, exploiting the micro-delays between their weapon cycles. She closed the distance. At point-blank range, her standard-issue rifle should have been useless, a toy against that armor. She proved that theory wrong, too. She didn't fire at the thick frontal plating. As she moved through their legs, a terrifyingly vulnerable position, her weapon snapped up and fired not at the armor, but at the complex joint housing of a knee actuator. A second shot hit a sensor cluster on its back. A third struck a coolant vent. She was targeting surgical weak points, minute vulnerabilities in the design that were considered irrelevant because no one was supposed to get close enough to exploit them. The first mech shuddered, its leg seizing up, and crashed to the ground. She was already engaging the next. The feat she was performing was considered a physical impossibility. To calculate the trajectory of incoming fire from multiple sources, plot an evasion path that accounted for her own velocity and the mech's turn rates, and simultaneously identify and target microscopic weak points on moving platforms. This was a processing task that required a quantum targeting matrix linked to a ship's main computer. She was doing it unaided in her head, while running at a full sprint under heavy fire. In the control room, the system's analysis algorithms were failing. Error messages populated the logs. Movement pattern unclassifiable. Target prioritization algorithm error. The technicians weren't even looking at the error reports anymore. They were just staring at the main feed, their arguments hushed and frantic. One insisted she had to be using some form of precognition, predicting where the shots would be before the mechs even fired. Another argued she was processing visual cues at a subconscious level we couldn't measure, reading the subtle telltales of a mech preparing to fire. Her situational awareness was the key. It wasn't just about seeing the threats directly in front of her. She was tracking all of them, their positions, their facing, their weapon states, creating a constantly updated mental map of the entire battlefield. The system's sensor logs confirmed it. Her head and eye movements were subtly tracking all 5 mechs simultaneously, even the ones behind her. This level of omnidirectional awareness was off the scale, exceeding any parameters previously recorded for any species, augmented or not. This was the turning point. Up in the observation deck, the silence was absolute. Vex 9 was no longer leaning forward. He was gripping the railing, his knuckles white. Krill was completely still. The amused condescension was gone, wiped away and replaced by something much colder. The dawning, unsettling realization that their tools were broken. They weren't just watching a recruit beat a test. They were watching their entire system of measurement, their foundational understanding of capability and threat, be proven utterly inadequate by a human woman running a zigzag pattern. They had been measuring drumming speed and she was composing a symphony. The battlefield shifted again, the heavy mechs dissolving into shimmering energy. The simulation grew quiet, deceptively still. This was the most insidious wave. Cloaked artillery batteries. They weren't just camouflaged. Their entire physical signature was masked by energy-dampening fields. To standard sensors, they were literal voids in space, completely undetectable until they fired. And once they fired, the saturation bombardment was usually instantaneous and lethal. Maya Torres stopped moving. She stood in the center of the plaza, her head tilted, her eyes scanning the empty air. It looked like confusion. It looked like she had finally met a problem she couldn't solve. Her rifle remained at her side. Then, with no apparent target, she raised it and fired a single shot into a patch of empty space 30 meters to her left. A brilliant cascade of energy erupted as her pulse hit something invisible, overloading the cloak and revealing the humming form of a massive artillery piece for a split second before it exploded. It was pure luck, I thought. A lucky guess. She fired again. Another patch of nothingness detonated. And again, a third battery shattered into light. It wasn't guesswork. The odds of hitting one cloaked unit by chance were astronomical. Hitting 3 in a row was a statistical impossibility. It implied a calculation. The technicians in the pit began speaking over each other, their voices a mixture of awe and disbelief. They were analyzing her shot placements, the timing, the angles. One of them, his voice trembling slightly, put forward the only theory that fit the data. He suggested she wasn't seeing them. He said she was calculating the probability of their existence. He used the term quantum probability manifold. It's a computational method used by high-level fleet tactical AIs to predict the most probable locations of cloaked vessels. It involves processing millions of variables in real time. Gravimetric shifts, minute energy bleed, localized space-time distortions. It is not something a biological brain can do. It requires processing power measured in exaflops, not the wetware of a human cortex. This mental feat is the sole domain of machines. Or so we thought. I watched her methodically eliminate the entire cloaked battery unit. 6 positions, 6 shots. She never missed. She never hesitated. There was no technological assistance. Her standard issue rifle had no special sensors. Her suit had no advanced computing modules. It was all her. The official logs from that moment, which I later reviewed, described her situational awareness with a single word: otherworldly. It was the only term they could find that fit. The system's own diagnostic reports were a litany of failure. Cloak detection, negative. Target acquisition source, unidentified. Engagement rationale, unavailable. The simulation's programming was baffled. It knew its own units were hidden. It could not reconcile their destruction with the fact that the subject had no means of perceiving them. The core programming assumed a certain set of sensory inputs. She was operating on a completely different set. The review of the sensor footage revealed the truth, but it was a truth that was more disturbing than any technological trick. She wasn't detecting the batteries directly. She was reading the environmental cues their presence created, the way a small cloud of dust swirled around an apparently empty space, disturbed by an energy field, the subtle refraction of light bending around a concealed mass, the almost imperceptible hum that was just a half tone off from the background ambient sound. These were not factors the programmers had considered. They had built a perfect cloak, but they had failed to perfectly cloak its effect on the world around it. She wasn't seeing the invisible. She was seeing the invisible shadow. This was the real revelation, the fundamental flaw it exposed. Our entire galactic understanding of perception was based on direct sensory input, augmented by technology. We looked for the thing itself. She was looking for the space the thing occupied. She was perceiving absence, not presence. We had spent millennia building better eyes. She was using the eyes she was born with to see things we didn't even know were there. It was a cognitive leap we had never made, a perceptual framework we lacked. We were searching for the signal. She was an expert in reading the noise. The air in the chamber seemed to solidify. The shattered remnants of the previous waves dissolved, and a new figure coalesced from the light. It was taller, broader, its form radiating an aura of absolute authority. Grand Marshal TX Prime. This was not just another combatant. It was the simulation's ultimate expression of tactical supremacy. A holographic construct containing the distilled strategic knowledge of generations. It represented the uncontested peak of galactic military doctrine, the final arbiter of combat excellence. This opponent was different. Its programming was not just reactive. It was predictive. Its adaptive learning protocols could analyze any known combat style, any documented strategy from across 17 systems, and generate a flawless counter in real time. It was designed to be unbeatable, the logical conclusion of millennia of organized warfare. It was the system's final argument, its way of reasserting the established order after the anomalies of the previous waves. Maya Torres did not immediately engage. She stopped. She stood her ground, her weapon held loosely. She watched the Grand Marshal. She watched the way it held its plasma glaive, the micro adjustments in its stance, the slight scan of its visual sensors. She was not preparing to fight. She was reading. Her eyes tracked over it with a calm, analytical focus. The observation timer on my console ticked away. 17 seconds. To the observers, it must have looked like hesitation, a moment of doubt before the inevitable defeat. Then she moved. Her engagement was not an attack. It was a conversation. She would feint high, and as TX Prime's systems calculated the parry for a high attack, she was already striking low. She would move left, prompting a specific counter movement from the hologram, and use that very movement to create an opening on the right. She wasn't fighting the warrior. She was fighting the code that animated it. She was operating on a set of principles that were completely alien to the galaxy's finest military minds. They saw a duel. She was debugging a program. I watched the Grand Marshal hologram begin to glitch. Its movements, once fluid and supremely confident, became jerky, uncertain. Its adaptive protocols were trying to counter her, but her tactics had no precedent. There was no pattern to analyze, no historical doctrine to reference. She was using strategies that simply did not exist in any military database. A form of combat improvisation so advanced it appeared to be pure chaos. But it wasn't chaos. It was a higher form of order, one the system lacked the language to comprehend. She exploited its core programming with surgical precision. The hologram was designed to counter known threats. Her every action was an unknown. The system's response protocols began to fail, returning null values and logic loops. The Grand Marshal, the embodiment of galactic military greatness, began to literally dissolve mid-action, its form flickering as the simulation's processing power was overwhelmed by the paradox she represented. Its defeat was not just physical. It was conceptual. The final stroke was not a dramatic killing blow. It was a simple, almost casual maneuver. She sidestepped a telegraphed lunge, placed her hand against the hologram's back and gave a slight push. The construct, already destabilized by the cognitive dissonance of her tactics, shattered into a million points of light. The entire confrontation had lasted 3 minutes and 48 seconds. The victory was so total, so absolute that the simulation had no prepared response. The victory fanfare did not play. The scoreboard did not update. The system simply stopped. Its primary objective, to test and evaluate, rendered meaningless. The silence that followed was heavier than any before. Up in the command deck, no one spoke. Vex 9 was no longer gripping the railing. He was leaning against it for support. This was the moment it truly ended. Not just the test, but the entire framework it represented. Centuries of tactical doctrine, volumes of strategic theory, the collective wisdom of the Galactic Military Academy, all of it, in that instant, became obsolete. They had built the perfect test of everything they knew. She had shown them everything they didn't. The simulation ended, just stopped. The chaotic battlefield of light and smoke dissolved back into the sterile white chamber walls. Maya Torres lowered her weapon with the same unhurried motion she'd used to raise it. There was no dramatic pose, no heavy breath of exertion. She simply stood there for a moment, then turned her head and looked directly through the reinforced observation window. She found the cluster of stunned faces on the other side, and then she did something no recruit had ever done. She smiled, a small calm thing, and gave a casual, almost friendly wave of her hand. It was the gesture of someone finishing a mild workout, not someone who had just shattered the galaxy's premier combat evaluation. The main console lit up, the system finally processing the conclusion of the event. The numbers appeared, stark and undeniable. Final time, 14 minutes, 57 seconds. It wasn't just a new record. It utterly demolished the previous one, shaving entire minutes off a time considered the absolute peak of biological performance. That was just the start. Her accuracy rating glowed a perfect 100% across every single engagement parameter the system measured. Every shot, every movement, every decision had been flawless. But the most damning piece of data was the final tactical assessment. The screen didn't display a score or a classification. It didn't offer a detailed breakdown. It simply returned one word in large red letters: impossible. The computer, the galaxy's most advanced analytical engine, had given up. It had no category for what it had just witnessed. I watched Commander Vex 9's face. The amusement that had been there less than 15 minutes ago was gone, completely erased. His features underwent a slow, almost painful transformation. The smug certainty drained away, replaced by a blank shock. It was the look of a man whose entire worldview has just been upended in a quarter of an hour. Beside him, Krill was staring at the main screen, his mandibles motionless. He leaned toward his console, his voice a low, disbelieving whisper. He read the results aloud. Then he read them again, and then a third time, as if the act of repetition could force the numbers to make sense. Down in the control pit, it was chaos. The technicians weren't celebrating. They were panicking. Their hands flew across consoles, pulling up diagnostic menus, running system integrity checks. They were convinced their equipment had to be malfunctioning. This level of performance was a physical impossibility, according to every biological and technological model in their database. They checked sensor calibration, hollow emitter alignment, processing core stability. They were looking for a glitch, a bug, a ghost in the machine. Anything to explain the data that was staring back at them. And through the observation glass, Maya Torres remained exactly as she was when she entered. Calm, Her breathing was even. Her posture was relaxed. She placed her weapon neatly back on the rack and stood waiting, her hands at her sides. She showed no sign of the immense physical and mental exertion she had just endured. The contrast was jarring. On one side of the glass, a group of highly trained professionals was descending into frantic disbelief. On the other, a single human woman stood in perfect serenity. This performance did more than break a record. It didn't just set a new high score. It took centuries of galactic assumptions about strength, capability, and threat assessment and smashed them on the floor. It proved that their entire framework for understanding the universe was built on a fundamental error. They had been measuring the wrong things. They had defined possible within such a narrow band that they had become blind to what lay outside it. Her flawless, impossible run was not an anomaly. It was a correction. The command chamber fell into a silence so complete it was heavier than the void between stars. The humming of consoles, the usual low murmur of technicians, all of it just stopped. The only sound was the faint, frantic clicking of Vex 9's claws against the railing. His eyes were locked on the main display, on that single damning word, impossible. Down in the pit, the technicians were already in motion, a controlled panic. Their fingers flew across their consoles, pulling up the combat footage. They didn't watch it once. They watched it on a loop. They'd run a sequence, freeze it, zoom in on some insignificant detail, shake their heads, and start it again. I saw one of them replay the moment she targeted the cloaked artillery battery 7 times in a row. His expression a mask of pure disbelief. He was looking for the trick, the glitch, the explanation that would make the universe make sense again. Commander Vex 9's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and strained. He demanded a full system diagnostic, not a routine check. A level 7 integrity sweep of the entire simulation core, the hollow emitters, the biometric sensors, every component. His tone held none of its former amusement. It was the voice of a man whose foundation was cracking beneath him, desperately trying to find stable ground. The order was relayed and the room filled with the low thrum of the system interrogating itself. I recorded the data stream, and with it, the audio from the command channel. I heard the rising panic in their voices as the diagnostic reports began to trickle in. Each subsystem reported back the same thing: green, normal, operational, no malfunctions, no calibration errors, no corrupted data. The system was perfect. The results were real. The confirmation did not bring relief. It deepened the crisis. That's when the realization started to hit. You could see it on their faces, a dawning horror. They weren't just looking at an anomalous test score. They were looking at proof that their threat assessment protocols were fundamentally flawed. The entire process, the vast bureaucratic machine designed to classify and quantify every species in the galaxy, was built on a premise that had just been proven false. Their faith in their own metrics was their blindness. The galaxy's classification system for species capability, a document that dictated diplomacy, trade, and military policy for centuries, was now completely questionable. Every entry, every rating, every assumption was suddenly suspect. If they were this catastrophically wrong about humanity, a species they had placed firmly in the lower tiers, what else had they missed? What other potential did their rigid scales fail to measure? I watched Vex 9 initiate a Priority 1 briefing request to High Command. His hand trembled slightly as he entered the authorization codes. This wasn't a routine report. This was a distress call for an entire paradigm. Their smug confidence, so palpable less than an hour ago, had completely evaporated, replaced by a genuine cold fear. They weren't afraid of her. They were afraid of what she represented. Their discussion was no longer about a single recruit. They whispered about the implications for galactic security assessments. Entire defense postures, fleet deployments, treaty obligations, all of it was predicated on a system of evaluation that was now broken. A single test result, achieved by one unaugmented human in a simulation chamber, threatened to rewrite military doctrine across every system in the galactic community. The silence returned, but now it was the silence of a tomb, and they were the ones buried inside it. Staring at the lid, the Admiral's personal cruiser, the Dominion's Edge, docked with a force that seemed to shake the entire station. The airlock cycled open not to a diplomatic entourage but to a full security detail. Admiral Korik strode onto the deck, his expression a mask of grim authority. Flanking him were a full squad of his personal guard, the elite warriors of the Talon Division. Their armor was polished to a mirror sheen, their weapons held at a low ready position. Their posture, their scanning glances, the way they positioned themselves to control the room. This wasn't an inspection. It was a preparation for a potential containment scenario. They were expecting a security threat, a dangerous unknown they had come to assess firsthand. The Admiral's voice cut through the tense silence. He demanded two things: the raw, unedited data logs from the simulation, and he demanded to see the human. Immediately. The command was absolute. There would be no briefing, no filtered reports. He wanted to confront the source of this disruption personally. I watched them lead him to the main briefing room. The scene inside was one of the most surreal contrasts I have ever witnessed. The room was filled with high-ranking officers, their faces tight with anxiety. The air hummed with nervous energy. And there, at the center of it all, sat Captain Maya Torres. She was at the conference table, one hand holding a sandwich. The other hand held a data tablet, which she was reading with apparent interest. The tablet's display showed a text on early galactic expansion history. She took a calm bite of her food, completely unaffected by the storm of military scrutiny swirling around her. The warriors at the door watched her every move, their hands resting on their weapon stocks. She turned a page on her tablet. Admiral Corex took this in, his own composure faltering for just a second. He approached the table, the officers parting for him. He didn't sit. He leaned forward, placing his knuckles on the polished surface. He ignored the sandwich, the history lesson. He got straight to the point. His questions were direct, harsh, demanding an explanation for what his instruments had recorded. He wanted to know what technological advantage she had employed, what hidden augmentation the scans had missed. He pressed her for a direct answer about the nature of her capabilities. Maya set her sandwich down neatly on its wrapper. She looked up at him, her expression polite and open. She didn't mention technology. She didn't speak of secret enhancements. She described her performance in the most mundane terms possible. She talked about standard human cognitive functions. She used phrases like advanced pattern recognition, applied game theory, and probabilistic forecasting. She explained these were not rare talents, but fundamental skills emphasized in certain fields of human endeavor. She spoke of them as one might describe basic literacy or arithmetic. It was a straightforward, almost casual explanation. This was the moment the situation shifted from alarming to profoundly disturbing. The Admiral and his officers had braced for a revelation of secret technology or biological tampering, things they could understand, quantify, and potentially counter. They were completely unprepared for the assertion that this terrifying proficiency was simply how some humans thought. Her calm, rational explanation of what they had deemed impossible was far more unsettling than any weapon or device could ever be. A weapon can be taken away, a way of thinking cannot. The Admiral slowly straightened up, his eyes never leaving her. The confidence of the warriors at the door seemed to diminish. They had come to face a threat they could shoot. They found one they had to outthink. Admiral Corex studied her for a long moment, his initial demand for hidden technology fading into a more unsettling line of questioning. He wanted to understand the scope. His voice was low, measured. He asked her to estimate how many humans might possess capabilities even remotely similar to her own. He was looking for a number, something he could plug into a threat matrix, a variable to quantify this new problem. Maya Torres considered the question. She didn't hesitate out of secrecy. She seemed to be doing the math in her head, weighing definitions. She gave a conservative estimate. 200 million. The number hung in the air, a simple integer that carried the weight of a tectonic shift. She clarified it wasn't just active military. It included reserves, specific law enforcement units, veterans, private security with advanced training. It was a pool of individuals with a certain mindset and skill set, scattered across her homeworld. This number did not compute for the officers in the room. You could see the physical impact. Several of them actually recoiled, a slight but unmistakable backward shift in their posture. Their faces, already strained, lost what little color they had. 200 million was not a specialist cadre. It was a population, a demographic. It was a number that spoke to a culture, not just a military. Their entire framework, built on the idea of technological parity determining military strength, shattered in that instant. Their ships were better, their weapons were better, but this wasn't about hardware. They realized with a dawning horror that humanity's potential was almost entirely cognitive. The advantage wasn't in what they built, it was in how they thought. Their entire assessment protocol, refined over centuries, had been measuring the wrong variables. They had quantified reactor output and shield density and beam refraction, and they had completely missed the engine running inside the pilot's skull. This wasn't a gap in technology. It was a gap in understanding. The crisis was immediate and profound. Their classification system was rendered obsolete. A species they had filed away as a pre-space lower-tier client race, amusing in its ambition but harmless in its capability, was suddenly something else entirely. The potential for that many adaptive, pattern-recognizing tactical operators existing in a single species was a security nightmare of the highest order. Human adaptability, it was now clear, could match or exceed the performance of their own best academy graduates, and it existed on a scale they had never conceived possible. The comfortable status quo, the unshakable belief in their own superior position, collapsed. The idea of humans as the harmless, curious newcomers was gone, swept away by a single number. They weren't looking at a curious anomaly anymore. They were looking at a fundamental reassessment of their place in the galactic order. The room felt colder. The Admiral's elite guards, who moments before had been scanning for a physical threat, now looked unsure, their eyes flicking between their commander and the calm woman at the table. The threat wasn't in the room. The threat was a concept, a number, and it was orbiting a star they had previously considered a backwater. The equation of power had just been rewritten, and they were no longer certain of their own value within it. Admiral Corex did not wait. He did not call for further analysis or form a committee. The order left his mouth the moment the implications settled in the room. A full revision of all threat assessments. Immediate priority. His focus was the Sol system, that quiet corner of space they had so casually dismissed. Its classification was no longer an administrative footnote. It was now the single most important data point in galactic security. The entire framework they used to interact with emerging species was now suspect, rendered obsolete by one woman's calm explanation. Humans were officially reclassified. Their status shifted from potential clients, a polite term for a civilization they planned to gently guide and exploit, to something far more concerning. Unknown capability. I recorded the terminology as it was entered into the main database. On the surface, it sounded neutral, a simple admission of a knowledge gap. But in our strategic lexicon, that designation carries a specific heavy weight. It is the label you use for a black box, for something you cannot predict, cannot model, and therefore cannot control. The officers around the table understood the gravity. Their murmured agreement was unanimous. A known threat, no matter how powerful, can be quantified. You can build defenses against it, plan counter-strategies, calculate acceptable losses. An unknown is different. An unknown could be anything. It could be insignificant. It could be catastrophic. The very lack of definition makes it inherently more dangerous. You are operating blind. Their new approach reflected this fear. They implemented a cautious information-gathering posture. No more assumptions. No more dismissals. Every interaction, every scrap of data, would now be collected and analyzed with the seriousness usually reserved for a peer adversary. Human cognitive flexibility was the core of this new concern. Their ability to adapt, to improvise, to find solutions outside established doctrine, made them a complete wildcard in the galaxy's carefully balanced power dynamics. Strength was no longer just about fleet size and shield density. It was about how a species thought. This was a variable they had never seriously factored into their equations. I watched this policy shift crystallize in real time during that briefing. You could see it on their faces the moment their professional arrogance was replaced by a sharp, sober caution. Their entire approach now emphasized one thing above all else: avoiding a catastrophic misjudgment through patient, careful study. This was not a victory. It was not a triumph of human potential. It was an admission of failure. Their failure. This moment represented a rare and profound humility from a galactic power that had spent centuries believing its own assessments were infallible. They were now forced to kneel, metaphorically, before a species they had summarily dismissed as weak. They were not bowing to a weapon. They were acknowledging a depth they could not measure. The policy was a direct result of that shattered confidence. They would watch. They would learn. They would try to understand the thing they had so carelessly underestimated, hoping it was not already too late. The goal was no longer integration or exploitation. The goal was simple survival in a universe that had just become much more complex and far less predictable. Admiral Corex's posture shifted from confrontation to calculation. The tension in the briefing room didn't dissipate, but its nature changed. The offer was made, his voice losing its hard edge. He proposed extended guest privileges for Captain Torres, full access, the station's archival libraries, its cultural exchange programs, even advanced military training modules typically reserved for Allied officers. It was a significant gesture, a pivot from treating her as a subject to treating her as a potential. Something else, an asset, a source of intelligence, a bridge. The intent was layered, a mix of genuine curiosity and deep strategic caution. They needed to understand what they were dealing with, and locking it away was no longer an option. Maya's response was immediate and genuine. Her face lit up with a bright, open enthusiasm that seemed out of place amidst the polished military austerity. She expressed a keen interest in galactic history, a desire to understand the context of the civilization she now found herself in, but she didn't just accept the offer. She extended one of her own. She offered to share human perspectives on tactical doctrine. It was a reciprocal gesture, a move that transformed the dynamic from a one-sided interrogation into a potential exchange. I watched her as she began to explain. She didn't boast. She analyzed. She gently critiqued the galactic military doctrine she had just dismantled. Not as flawed, but as rigid. She described it as a magnificent, complex machine, incredibly powerful but predictable. She explained that human military philosophy, forged in a different crucible, favored adaptability over fixed doctrine. She spoke of it as a core cultural value. Improvisation, creative problem-solving, the ability to look at a set of rules, a battlefield, a situation, and see not just the intended solution, but a dozen others that weren't in the manual. This was a masterstroke of perception management. In a single conversation, she reframed humanity's terrifying capability not as a threat but as a potential complement. She presented it not as something to be feared, but as a different tool, a different way of thinking that could be added to the galaxy's existing toolbox. She painted a picture of mutual benefit. The galaxy could offer its technology, its history, its scale. Humanity could offer its cognitive agility, its flexibility, its novel approaches to old problems. The implication was profound. It hinted at a future that was not a confrontation, but a collaboration. A future where galactic strategy, traditionally so reliant on overwhelming force and established protocol, could be infused with a new kind of agility, where human adaptability could inform grand strategy, offering new solutions to entrenched conflicts or unforeseen crises. The officers in the room were still wary, still grappling with the shock of the last hour, but you could see the seeds of a new thought taking root. This wasn't about surrendering to a superior force. It was about integrating a superior method of thought. The exchange was no longer just about gathering intelligence on a potential threat. It was the first tentative step toward a synthesis, a blending of galactic might with human ingenuity. The potential was staggering, a complete reimagining of what power could look like. It was an offer to learn and in doing so to evolve. The galaxy received a harsh but necessary lesson that day. Danger does not always announce itself with roaring engines or gleaming armor. It can arrive quietly with a calm smile and a simple question about environmental hazards. The universe became a slightly more cautious, more interesting place. We had been taught to watch for the obvious threat. Now we understood the real risk lay in the unassuming, in the things our systems were not built to measure. Throughout the tense aftermath, Maya Torres remained a study in serenity. While admirals panicked and technicians scrambled, her demeanor never shifted from that same calm focus she'd shown in the prep room. The chaos of reassessment swirled around her, a storm of shouted orders and frantic data analysis, and she sat at its center like the eye of a hurricane. She was an island of quiet in a sea of institutional anxiety. I watched her pull out her personal data tablet. She resumed the puzzle game she had been playing earlier. Her fingers moved across the screen with the same precise, economical motions she had used to target siege mechs. The contrast was jarring. Here was the being who had just redefined galactic warfare, casually solving an illuminated logic grid, while the highest levels of military command grappled with the implications of her existence. She looked up at one point, caught my eye through the observation window, and gave that small, calm smile. It was the smile of someone who had not just broken a system, but had enjoyed the process of understanding it. This was the true nature of human confidence. It did not manifest as aggression or bluster. It showed itself as a profound, relentless curiosity. Their strength was not in a desire to dominate, but in a readiness to learn, to understand, to solve. This intrinsic motivation, this drive to engage with and master complex systems, was their greatest asset. It was a form of power we had never thought to look for. The galaxy's value system began a quiet but seismic shift. Pattern recognition and adaptive thinking, once abstract cognitive concepts, were suddenly discussed as strategic assets, on par with plasma cannons or quantum shields. Military experts who had spent their careers studying hardware specifications now found themselves poring over texts on human game theory and cognitive psychology. The conversation was no longer just about how to fight more effectively. It was about how to learn more effectively, how to think more flexibly. This was the fundamental change. Humanity's quiet mastery did not force a military defeat. It forced an intellectual revolution. The power dynamics shifted not because they had bigger guns, but because they had better questions. Their value was not in what they possessed, but in how they processed information. This reframing of capability rippled through every department, from tactical analysis to diplomatic relations. That day in the simulation chamber was not an end. It was a beginning. It marked the start of a new era in how the galactic community would interact with unknown variables. It was the moment we learned that the most significant discoveries are not always about finding new stars, but about discovering new ways to see the ones we already have. The age of assuming superiority based on obvious metrics was over. A new age of cautious, curious engagement had begun, all because one human woman treated an impossible test like an interesting puzzle. My official role here was to log events, but what I witnessed that day went far beyond procedural documentation. This was a professional crisis of the highest order. The implications of Captain Torres's performance demanded a complete rewrite of standard assessment protocols. I was not just watching an exceptional recruit, I was witnessing the complete and total failure of the system designed to measure her. Her run wasn't just excellent. It was category-breaking. The simulation was the most advanced tool of its kind, employed across 17 star systems and considered the absolute gold standard for evaluating military talent. It was built to measure everything from reaction time to strategic adaptation, quantifying genius-level performance for every known species. Maya Torres did not just score high. She exceeded the system's very parameters. Her actions created data points the algorithms had no capacity to process or categorize. The machine, in its final assessment, could only return one result: impossible. Recording the event, I noted the tools she used were not technological. They were purely cognitive. She employed fundamental human cognitive architecture. Her effectiveness was built on three core pillars: advanced pattern recognition, intuitive leaps of logic, and applied game theory. She saw the battlefield not as a series of discrete threats, but as a complex, interconnected system of probabilities. Every movement, from her zigzag charge to her targeting of cloaked units, was a calculated manipulation of that system. These skills required no enhancement, no implants, no external hardware. This was the critical blind spot. The galaxy's military doctrine had become entirely reliant on hardware. We measured shield density, reactor output, and beam refraction. We graded species on their technological level and the physical augmentations they could acquire. This obsession with tangible, quantifiable assets made us blind to the potential of the software, the wetware in this case, running inside the pilot's skull. We were so busy analyzing the sword, we never considered the mind of the one wielding it. I watched the military experts in the observation deck struggle to comprehend her approach. They were masters of established doctrine, thinkers who understood warfare as a series of known variables and predictable outcomes. They stared at the footage, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. They could describe what she did, but they could not explain how she did it. Their entire lexicon, their entire framework for understanding combat excellence was useless. The evaluation metrics they had spent their careers upholding were suddenly, irrevocably obsolete. This event was more than a new test record. It was a paradigm shift. The simulation, designed to be the ultimate test of an individual, had instead become the ultimate test of our own understanding. And we had failed. The system was not wrong. It was simply inadequate. It could not measure what it was not built to see. The realization that forced its way into that room was a cold one. If our premier assessment tool could be so completely invalidated by a single individual from a supposedly inferior species, then our entire strategic outlook was built on a foundation of sand. We were not just revising a score. We were staring down the need for a complete revision of what we thought was possible. The security implications of that day spread far beyond the simulation chamber, seeping into every department and agency tasked with charting the galaxy's future. We were no longer looking at a combat anomaly. We were facing a systemic failure. The realization that a biological mind could consistently outperform our most advanced AI in cognitive tasks meant that our core assumptions about power and progress were wrong. Everything changed in that moment. Every risk assessment, every strategic forecast, every long-term plan suddenly required a complete and painful revision. The reassessment was not limited to military files. The ripple effect was immediate and total. Diplomatic protocols were pulled for review. Economic models that projected human development based on technological adoption rates were rendered useless. Cultural exchange programs, once considered soft power outreach, were now reclassified as critical intelligence-gathering operations. The very lens through which we viewed an entire species had to be ground down and polished anew. I watched the Security Council convene an emergency session. The usual agenda was scrapped. Their first order of business was to radically expand their review parameters. They issued directives to intelligence branches that had never before interacted with species analysis. They began pulling data on human history, not just their wars, but their art, their literature, their games. They were no longer looking for technological milestones or resource maps. They were searching for the origins of a mindset. Their new focus was pattern recognition development in human culture. They studied their ancient board games, their complex narrative structures, their musical compositions. They analyzed childhood development programs that emphasized creative problem-solving, over rote memorization. Their improvisational traditions, things like jazz music and comedic theater, once dismissed as cultural curiosities, were suddenly reevaluated and found to hold immense strategic value. These were not mere entertainments. They were training grounds for a unique form of cognitive flexibility. The galaxy in that moment realized a sobering truth. We had been measuring the wrong things for far too long. Our centuries-long obsession with technological benchmarks, with quantifiable metrics like energy output and computational speed, had created a profound blind spot. We had assumed that because a species lacked certain hardware, they were inherently lesser. We had completely failed to account for the software. Human potential, it turned out, was not in what they had, but in how they thought. Their strength was a process, not a possession. This fundamental redefinition of capability sent shockwaves through every interspecies interaction. Trade negotiations, alliance treaties, even scientific collaborations, all were now subject to this new unsettling variable. We could no longer assume superiority. We had to assume nothing.